Welcome back to the Afterword, a conversation about the future of words. We're glad to have Mike Darrow, the Executive Director of Feeding the Carolinas, and Alan Harkey, the Regional Director of Feed the Children, here with us to continue our conversation about the impact of hunger in the world. Hunger's been tied to issues like poverty and war and climate change. Now we're adding a pandemic to the list. What are the correlations and patterns that impact hunger, and how have those changed in 2020? Alan, let's hear from you, and then we'll jump over to Mike, if that's okay.
Sure. The fact is, at least in my mind, again, poverty and hunger are inextricably tied together, but extreme poverty disproportionately affects kids. I mean, think about it. 387 million, or 19.5% of the world's children, live in extreme poverty. I mean, we can't even relate to that. But so many of this problem, it's caught up, it's perpetuated again by this cycle. Living in poverty brings hunger, and living with hunger prolongs poverty. For example, in war-torn areas of the world, it hits farmers especially hard. Conflict can evict them from their land, destroy the crops, the livestock, prevent them from acquiring seed and fertilizer, or even selling their produce. Access to water, all of it disrupts the cycle. And even climate, as every farmer knows. Now, my wife is a good gardener, I am not. But climate impacts everything from the quality to the quantity of the crops. So all of it is tied together. Is it different now than it was years ago? I think history tends to repeat itself. And unfortunately, hunger has been around as long as man. Just flipping casually through the Gospels, we see how physical hunger, even then, was crippling, a dividing line for that Judean culture in the first century. I don't know, have we gotten any better? Is it a matter of technology or more a matter of the heart? I think it's the latter. I truly do, Alan.
That's a remarkable answer. And, I don't know if I ever shared this with you, but I was maybe 5 or 6 years old, and my grandmother would watch Christian television on Sunday mornings before we went to church. And every week, Larry Jones from Feed the Children was on. And he wasn't particularly animated, but he would sit behind a desk, just sort of talk at the camera. And then it would move away from him to carry the story from a different part of the world. And I think that's the first time I realized that there were people in other places and people who lived considerably differently from me. I don't know if this was a good thing or not, but I was sort of fascinated with the idea that there were these people who lived in such extraordinary poverty. And that was during the time of the Ethiopian famine in the early to mid 80s.
Right.
And I can still see in my mind the pictures that he would show of that event. And it's probably what really started me having an interest in international development and in seeing what could be done to alleviate that kind of extreme suffering.
Wow.
Because it's something that everybody can get a hold of, right? We all know what it's like to be a little bit hungry. And so we have a place to latch on to what other people are experiencing with that. What about you, Mike? What would you say?
I agree with all that. And I would also say that one of the common threads, I guess, whether it's a pandemic or it's a hurricane or it's war overseas, but looking more locally, many of these things will disproportionately impact lower income populations. When you look at the pandemic in particular and look at the unemployment, what was the first thing to go was service industries, hospitality industries, restaurants, catering, service workers who are at minimum wage or part-time or that could at least afford losing their jobs. And we're seeing in the Carolinas, unemployment rates are coming down and they're getting better, but they're disproportionately getting better with white collar, with higher professional incomes, higher income folks. But you look at the unemployment rates of the service industry, again, hospitality, they're still struggling. And so, just like a hurricane, a pandemic, a recession, they all disproportionately impact those who are dancing or below that poverty line, who are dealing with hunger, and they're dealing with health issues, and they're dealing with homelessness, and they're dealing with all the different things that are all tied together. So that's the biggest thing we see with the pandemic is, once again, it disproportionately impacts those who can handle it the least.
Mike, you just perfectly segued into our next question. Because there's a theory in education that we call the Matthew effect, and it comes from the Bible. The rich get richer and the poor get poorer. Richer countries demand richer foods, and that leaves a gap for poor communities. How can our global diets help sustain the increase in the numbers of people who need food? And Mike, I'm going to ask you first.
I would say that food waste is a big issue. If you think about portion sizes, when you go to a restaurant, or what used to be before the pandemic, when you go to the all-you-can-eat buffets or whatever, there's a significant amount of food waste that happens, especially in the more developed countries, first world countries, United States. And so if we could just get a handle on minimizing food waste, and I think that could go a long way through that as well, because as you say, the gap will continue to grow. And so, food waste is one, and then, logistics issues of just getting the food to the right place in the right area. But food waste is a big issue, I think.
Again, I'm kind of like the pennies are dropping, and that makes so much sense. How about you, Alan?
You think about the numbers, Amy. This helps put it in context. Right now, there are approximately 795 million people who are hungry. Now, that blows the mind, but listen to this. Another 2 billion are expected to join them by the year 2050. Now, to me, that's a huge dose of cognitive dissonance, because we think global food production is incredibly efficient. I mean, the world's farmers produce enough food to feed 1.5 times the global population. That's enough to feed 10 billion people. And think about it, we're only at 7.6 billion currently. So we might ask, okay, despite this excess, hunger still exists. Why? In a short sentence, because defeating hunger is not a priority. Think about it. Globally, just as Mike alluded to, 30 to 40% of food is simply wasted. It's thrown out. It's easier to throw it out than get to children and adults who are dying of malnutrition. Think about when we have dinner tonight, and we may leave a little bit on our plates. And where does it go? We scrape it into the garbage. Well, listen, we've all been in places right here in the United States, overseas, where people would walk a mile, 2 miles, 3 miles for that little bit of food. My parents used to tell me when I was a kid, you do what you want to do. We accomplish what we deem is important. And for some reason or the other, this idea that there are 795 million people in the world that are hungry right now, that children are dying every minute from malnutrition, it doesn't matter to enough people. Well, it matters to them. It matters to that parent that will have to bury a child tomorrow because their child didn't get enough to eat. Our job, and Mike put it really, really well a little bit ago when he said, I agree, awareness is one of the central issues. I live in Simpsonville, South Carolina, and I guarantee you, if I walk down the sidewalk tonight in the middle of town and I just randomly ask people, do you know that there are 795 billion people that are hungry? And the kids are dying by the minute? Most of them would look at you like a deer in headlights. What? Where? But when that light bulb kicks in, things begin to change. Folks, listen. I've said it before and I say it again. We're Americans. We're blessed. And part of that blessing is being a world leader, a nation that helps to set example. And we've got to do that. Every person in this listening audience, yeah, you're only one person, But one person can make all the difference in the world. You may not be able to go into the poor areas of Chicago and other large cities. You may not be able to go overseas and be a missionary or a doctor. But right now, what you can do is to begin to pray, to pick organizations like Mike's, like ours, that feed the children and others, and say, you know what? I'm going to invest. I'm going to make a difference. I'm going to leave a legacy. And that, Amy, I think will make the difference.
Very well said. Very well said. Thank you, both of you, for those answers.
We alluded to this earlier, and I'd like to go back and kind of drill down a little bit further, if we could, about how crops and livestock get used in many areas of the world, either for fuel or crops are used to feed the livestock instead of the children, as you were mentioning, Alan. What changes need to occur to put more food into the supply chains for more people?
From my perspective, and Holland, let's reach back a moment and think about blindness prevention, because it's so illustrative. One of the number one reasons that people are going blind in the developing world, particularly children, is vitamin A deficiency. Just simple vitamin A deficiency. And as we said earlier, teaching moms how to prepare food, not to give the green leafy vegetables to the livestock, but to the children, can make all the difference in the world. And teaching agriculture. I mean, we like CBMI and other organizations, we have agricultural specialists that are teaching communities how to farm. I never will forget, I was on a trip to, I think it was around Mombasa. No, it was in southern India, excuse me. And our people at CBM were actually teaching blind men how to farm. And when they told me I was going to go see that, I thought, now, how do you teach a blind person how to farm? Well, you drive a wooden stake on one end of the row, you drive a stake on the other end and stretch a piece of string between the two. And then you get down on your hands and knees and follow the string and plant the crops and cultivate them that way. And we actually had people coming from all over the area. They wanted to know why the blind guys were raising better crops, and talk about the blind leading the sighted. But we're doing the same thing with Feed the Children. We're teaching people how to farm, how to cook, how to save that nutrition for their kids and families. And once again, it's back to education.
That's a great answer. And I do remember those blind farmers drawing the attention of the community to what they were doing. We sort of assume that if people have been doing something for a long time, that they know how to do it well. And that's sometimes true, but not always, right?
That's absolutely correct. I think they call that condition hardening of the categories. You just keep doing it.
Mike, what do you think? How are we going to get more food into the supply chain for more people?
Yeah, I think there's some economic or policy ways we can do that. For example, right now, because of some trade issues and tariffs and all, farmers had excess product that wasn't being exported, and so the government steps in through what's called TFAP, the Emergency Food Assistance Program, and purchases commodities from farmers, milk, cheese, etc. And through the USDA, that gets shipped out to the food banks to distribute. And so with some current, tariff issues going on now that will be ending soon, we've been the beneficiary of that. Well, there's ways to kind of manage that, I think, from a more positive perspective, to make sure that our farmers are incentivized to be able to produce, the products and sell them for use as food. And so whether that's subsidies or whatever, there's economic ways to manage that, and how we manage our trade internationally as well impacts the food supply chain as well. And so there are economic or policy issues that we need to be considering when we play around with tariffs or trade agreements and things like that, and supporting our farmers as well.
That's a great answer. And I'm going to put in a shameless plug here for folks. If you've not listened to Amy's and my conversation with Dr. Mark Ferguson and Scott Luton about supply chains, you can go back in the podcast list and find that one, because we did not expect that supply chains would be the first story to come out of the pandemic. Everybody, thinks about the pandemic stories we've seen on TV or read about in novels. We see ourselves surviving the end of the world. You don't see yourself running out of toilet paper. But the way supply chains work, that's what happened. And just in case you missed that one, you can go back and get a little catch up and sort of understand what Alan and Mike are talking about when we think about how it works, how we move product and how we move food from place to place.
I'm going to have to go back and listen to that, because that is the supply chain disruption was the biggest and most immediate result of the pandemic. So I'll be interested. I'm going to make sure I listen to that one. I'm interested to hear that.
Yeah. Thank you. And Alan, I couldn't agree with you more. Let's talk just a little bit. And Mike, you touched a little bit of it, but if you were the policymaker, and again, Alan, you talked about this when you said, defeating hunger is not a priority. And I'm almost imagining Alan, and I know that it's a podcast, so all of our listeners are going to just have to imagine Alan with this placard. I can just see him in a march right now. Defeating hunger is not a priority. So how would we want to switch this? How can we reverse this, pivot this with politics and policy to support defeating hunger? What would you say, Alan?
Well, before entering the not-for-profit world about 27 years ago, and I hope you don't hold this against me, but I spent about a dozen years in politics working for 2 senators and a U.S. congressman out of the state of Florida. And people ask me all the time, Alan, what did you learn from that experience? And my answer is simply this: the answers are not found on the banks of the Potomac. I hate to say that. You look back at our own history, Amy, as a country, and this country was born in the pulpits of America. The church has always been important in the development of a culture in its history. And sadly, over the years, we've become more and more reliant on public leaders, politicians, to come up with the answers, to provide the leadership. But all too often, what they provide is a limit to freedom, a suppression of the intellect, a suppression of real ability born out of individual ingenuity. And it's not surprising that the answer has the answer. And so one of the things that we successfully did with Vision 2020, yes, we challenged ministers of health all over the developing world to make blindness a priority. That's advocacy. You have to do that. But we also challenged the church worldwide to do that, of every denomination. I remember being in Rome as the late Pope John looked out over a mass of tens of thousands of people and through media called out to the world, to churches everywhere, do something about this problem. As the founder of World Vision once said, let your heart be broken by the things that break the heart of God. And so, yes, I'm a pastor as well as working full-time with Feed the Children. But I really agree with those who say the church is the sleeping giant. And if we could just get back to taking church out of the 4 walls, to stopping where Jesus stops, and touching the people that he touches, I think problems like hunger, disability, these kinds of problems really would buckle under the weight of compassion on behalf of the faith-based community. I truly do. And that's my answer.
Amazing. Take the church out of the 4 walls. I think we're going to put a hashtag on that one. How about you, Mike?
Yeah, we need to hashtag that. Boy, Alan, you are singing my song and preaching my sermon, my friend. that is a personal passion of mine that when the pandemic first started, when the first messaging I was doing, from a Feeding the Carolinas perspective was, let's check with our neighbors. Put your mask on, stay socially distanced, but are your neighbors hungry? Let's make sure they're okay. Maybe they can't get to the grocery store. Let's go help them. Probably one of the worst inventions in the South that ever happened was air conditioning, because it drove us indoors and off our front porches, and we don't know our neighbors. And to Alan's point, the church could really play a role. And God's put this burden on me about our churches becoming inward focused and less outward focused. And so we need to be punching out those walls and getting out to our local communities and help be the solution. And it's not just hunger. I mean, any social issue, any topic, the church can play a role and we can stay out of the politics. At Feeding the Carolinas, we try not to be political. We try to stay nonpartisan and stay out of that. Other than, again, anything that helps feed more people, we're in favor of. But it's not about, you're right, it's not on the banks of the Potomac, as you said. It's in Simpsonville. It's in Lexington, North Carolina. It's in the little town of Port Byron, New York, where I grew up with 1,800 people. That's where the answer is. And it's the churches and the folks sitting in the pews. And there's a lot we could be doing. And I'm talking about myself. I'm not just, pointing fingers outward. I'm pointing inward. There's things that we can be doing to push out those walls of the church and to get busy. And you can't, meet people's spiritual needs until you're meeting their physical needs. And there's a lot we can do.
Wonderful. Mike did talk earlier about food banks changing for the better. And maybe we know that nothing important happens without pain, and that there's a purpose in pain. And maybe church is expanding when we punch out holes in the walls and move forward on this issue. Thank you both.
All right. We have one final question. It's our signature question here on our podcast. And since we're all about words and stories, we like to ask, what's a metaphor to help us understand hunger and its impact? Anyone who wants to go first, just jump in there.
Well, Holland, I think that of all people, you would be surprised to hear me quote Mahatma Gandhi. I think he said it best. There are people in this world that are so hungry that God can't appear to them except in the form of bread.
That says it all.
Right there. Nailed it.
Yeah, it's hard to top that one. Yeah, I think, from a spiritual perspective, we can't help people spiritually until we help them physically. And that, hunger is real. Hunger is real. And it shouldn't be. Shame on us.
My goodness. Every time we start an episode, we just never know where we're going to land.
We learn so much, right?
I'm fired up.
So, Mike, how can people find out more about Feeding the Carolinas, how they can get involved, and how they can help?
Sure. In the Carolinas, feedingthecarolinas.org is our website. And we have on there, you can find a food bank. And so you can search by county and see which of our food banks serves your county. And then within each of our 10 member food banks, we have links on each of their food bank contact information for finding a local pantry, for volunteering, and for donating. And so you can drill right down to your community. If you're outside the Carolinas, Feeding America is a great resource. And of course, Feed the Children and other organizations like that as well. But as far as Feeding the Carolinas go, you can go to our website and you can drill down as low community-wise as you want and see where you can help. Volunteering, giving, it's the time, talent, and treasure. And tell others, help. If you're on Facebook, Feeding the Carolinas, share it with others.
So we can go to feedingthecarolinas.org or find Feeding the Carolinas on Facebook.
Yeah, we're on Facebook. So yes, sir.
Excellent. Thank you. Alan, how do folks find out more about Feed the Children and how they can help?
Feedthechildren.org. There is a wealth of information. You can also find us on Facebook. But just as Mike mentioned, there are lots of things to do. You can find stories that will inspire you, that will captivate you. You can look at photos, videos. It's an incredible experience. I re-challenge myself and everyone who cares about hunger, wherever it's at. Let's be that generation that takes action. Let's do something. It's the best way in the world to help advance the kingdom of God on this earth. So thank you so very, very much for having us on today. Holland, Amy, you're doing an incredible work.
Yeah, let me echo that. I appreciate what y'all are doing. And Alan, you're right. Let's go get rid of put Alan and me out of work. Put us out of a job, people.
You can find Alan and Feed the Children at feedthechildren.org. You can find Mike and Feeding the Carolinas at feedingthecarolinas.org. You can find both organizations on Facebook, and we can get involved and help end hunger both in our local community and around the world. You can also join us next week. We'll be talking about stories of incarceration and re-entry in our culture.
We just want to thank Alan Harkey tonight and Mike Darrow just for being wonderful guests at the table. This has been an inspiring conversation. And as you wait for our next episode, please leave us a review, rate us on Apple Podcasts, become a subscriber to the afterwordpodcast.com. It does help us keep the conversations going. And please remember, as always, you are welcome at our table.